We weren't expected to have careers or anything, and the girls just sort of waited around to get engaged and get married hopefully by the time they were 21, or else they were considered spinsters and on the shelf. And the boys, they sort of went into apprenticeship things, got their first pair of grey strides when they turned 15, just like Dad. And so all of a sudden, one day, out of America came rock and roll. It was just amazing. Our lives just changed overnight. I felt as if I'd been plugged into a power socket. And the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And I actually thought I died and gone to heaven. We just got right into it. All of a sudden, we had our own music.
Look what you done, my baby. Look what you done, my baby. Look what you done to my heart. I've got those lonely, 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 lonely blues. Lonely, lonely blues. That's just a short version, eh? Yeah, well, everybody knows it anyway. Well, used to know it.
I've got those lonely, 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 lonely blues. Lonely.
It's 1955, and New Zealand's post-war suburban slumber is about to be rudely interrupted. The drums are beating in America, and Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock is a runaway hit. Wellington-based record company HMV wants to cash in with a local cover version. Problem is, there are no rock and rollers in New Zealand. The closest HMV can get is country and western singer Johnny Cooper, the popular Maori cowboy.
We were under contract to HMV yesterday, and the boss there, Dave Van Weed, he called me in and said, there's a new sound hitting America, and it's big, it's taken off. He said it's called rock and roll. We've never heard of anything called rock and roll before,
It was quite astounding. It was so totally different. This rock and roll music had a different beat. It was using the instruments entirely different, and it was something that was a little bit difficult to get used to.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock rock, that kind of stuff, and you think 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock rock, and what type of song is that? I mean, in those days you didn't sing those kind of, well, there was no such thing.
But we persevered, and I said to him, you'll be singing it, Johnny, I'm sure. Next Tuesday in the Majestic Cabaret, we'll record it. So we had a group formed, and a few of us went down there and we recorded it.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11...
Johnny feels obliged to follow his record company's lead, but his country and western band can't follow the new beat.
I had to record it, had to sing it, and they had to get other musicians, jazz musicians from Wellington, because in those days it was all jazz, the musicians were jazz musicians.
Johnny's pickup jazz band plays it safe with a little bit of swing, and the Kiwi version of Rock Around the Clock is released in October of 1955. But very few believe this rock and roll thing has any future at all.
When the chimes ring 5, 6 and 7.
Even the jazz musicians in Wellington at the time, they wouldn't play that kind of stuff. To them, it was, you know, a load of rubbish. It was actually noisy, really. You know, everything was bang, 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 you know. Man, it just took off. And everybody was doing it, you know. The beat, the dances, you know, rock and roll dances, you know. It just took over. And that's rock and roll.
Johnny Cooper is a reluctant rock and roller, but the new music becomes part of his travelling talent quest. And then he meets a teenager from Wanganui, who's the real deal.
Somebody came out to me and said, "Who's that chap singing in the foyer when the people come out after the show? There's somebody doing, you know, Elvis stuff, rocking and rolling." And no, I didn't know this, and so I went in one time after the show and had a look, and it was Johnny Devlin performing, you know, to the audience as they came out after the show, and he was doing rock and roll, Elvis stuff, and they were loving it.
It was Rock Around the Clock. It was number one, and it was number one on the Lever Hit Parade. And my brothers and I heard it, and we said, "Wow, you know, this is good music. Let's get into this." And of course, from there, Elvis appeared, and Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard, all the big American acts. So I ended up becoming a very big Elvis Presley fan, and bought all of his records, and learned them off.
One of Johnny Devlin's early performances is captured by Hawke's Bay filmmaker Ron Crabtree. He's trying to make a rock and roll movie in the style of those that Hollywood's producing for the new teenage market. Johnny's finding an audience too, but not enough to give up his day job.
Actually, it was Napier at the Swing and Sway Club that I was first paid my first fee, which was 10 shillings. And then I got £5 from the Cabana nightclub, which was on the border there between Hastings and Napier. And I thought, this is not a bad sort of a lurk. We'll have to try and do more of these. But unfortunately, the gigs didn't come that often. And so I just kept doing seasonal work in the freezing works and Woolster or whatever was going. And then at the weekends, I'd sing wherever I could.
Meanwhile, Auckland businessman Dave Dunningham hears the sound of money in the new music and sets up a rock and roll dance hall downtown. He gets jazzmen Frank Gibson Sr., Merv Thomas and Bernie Allen to form the house band.
I think we started off with hearing a couple of records. We took the licks off. Merv transcribed the lyrics, and we went up to the trades hall and started this rock and roll band. And I think they changed the name to the Jive Centre. Well, we couldn't believe it. The place exploded. Suddenly we had all these young people coming from everywhere. The place was packed every Friday and Saturday night. And there was a degree of hysteria about the whole place, and it was a lot of fun.
Anyone that could pick up a few chords on a guitar could play rock and roll, yeah. It was very easy to sing. I think that was half the appeal of it too. And it was wonderful to dance to. Wonderful.
And when you filled that big room with people jiving, it was the most stimulating thing to look at, especially as a musician. You were playing, you were providing the music, the rhythm, and out there's a sea of people with skirts flying, you know, and girls going over the heads of their partners. It was great. And that dance hall, the Jive Centre, took off like a rocket.
It was just a wonderful, warm, friendly, exciting, happening place. It was just jumping. I remember Bob Paris, Splish Splash, I was taking a bath, and of course Johnny Devlin. That's where I first saw him.
Devlin's big break comes while he's up in Auckland on holiday. He chances an audition at the Jive Centre, and almost overnight, his star is born.
I just made all these various movements up and to the music, you know. I mean, if there was a break in the music, I'd do a bit of a shake, you know, sort of thing, you know, a bit of a stop, and just got right into it. And I think that's what made the girls all start screaming. never forget the first time that happened, because I'd never struck anything like a pack of girls screaming at you. You know, I thought I must have left my fly undone or something.
The kids used to stop and watch them, which was another phenomenon that I had never seen before, because when we played for ballroom dancing, people got up and they very nicely danced around the floor. But here we were playing, and the people had actually stopped dancing and had come up to the front of the stage and sat there and watched.
Up until then, we didn't have a youth culture. But after rock and roll, we had a youth culture, and he was their icon because he belonged to us. He was our own.
In the South Island, the new beat inspires a teenage rocker to run his own weekly dances. Max Merritt is doing his best to turn a conservative city into a hotbed of rock and roll.
Christchurch, it had the Littleton port was just over the hills, and so we used to have a lot of the English, seamen coming into the place, and it was a very happening scene in Christchurch at that time. There had been only one rock and roll dance before me in town. That was by Martin Winiata. He was a saxophone player, and he was a lot older than me. But we actually started up my dance, and he sort of went out of business because all the kids came to where the young band was playing,
Max was about a year and a half, maybe a little more older than I was. And I used to get into that place and watch Max, who was doing very much a sort of a Bill Haley large rock and roll band. They had sax, piano, guitar, bass drums. And what I loved was that all the young people were there all dancing and jiving, and because I could dance, I was into the jiving big time. And Max really, seeing him there rocking away as a young guy, inspired me that it could be done.
Well, of course, the oldies hated it, rock and roll was the devil's music, but being a teenager, we loved it. You had to go to a dance to hear it, or you heard it special times on the radio, and that was rock and roll. It wasn't not going to last anyhow.
New Zealand is a very remote outpost in the new world of rock and roll, but Christchurch is a main line to the latest overseas sounds, the American servicemen stationed at the city's Operation Deep Freeze base.
They used to come down to my dance, and they'd bring all the records off the jukebox, and so I was getting things like Albert King, Freddie King, and all the Solomon Burke and people like that, all the great blues players and singers of the time. And so that started to influence me in another way, And little did I know that I didn't use it all terribly at that time, but years and years later, I would drag that stuff out and sort of help form what I am today.
So much sinner, now everybody calls me old Brenner.
Max is the undisputed rock and roll champ of the South.
Yeah.
But in the North, the name on everyone's hips is Johnny Devlin.
Well, I went to a dance on a Saturday night. I see a chicken in the corner, she looks all right. I walked on along and then she looked at me and then...
One night when I was singing there, a little chap standing in the middle of the dance floor with his hands over his ears. And I thought, well, I'm either singing out of tune or I'm singing too loud or I'm doing something wrong. And he just kept standing there with his hands over his ears. And anyway, when I finished, I bowled up to him and I was introduced to him. He said, my name's Philip Warren. He said, I said, what were you standing there with your hands over your ears for? And he said, well, I was just trying to hear what you'd sound like on tape. And then I found out that he had his own record label, and he said, well, I'd like to record you. And I said, okay, well, I got a real buzz out of that because I knew that was the next step, to cut my first record.
How would you be?
For his first single, Devlin chooses to cover one of Elvis Presley's few flops, Lordy Miss Claudie. The next step is for Devlin to take his new band, The Devils, on the road. There's a ready-made national circuit in the Kerajodian theatre chain and a public hungry for rock and roll.
We were going to sell records if we went on tour because every place we went, you know, I did record bar appearances. And that's actually when Lordy Miss Claudie took off. You know, we used to sell boxes and boxes of records at the record bar appearances. There was nothing, you know, for 400 or 500 people to turn up at a record bar appearance. And I just kept signing and signing and signing. I kept bringing the boxes in, and everybody wanted to buy it. And eventually they lost count of the sales. It was rumoured that it sold over 100,000 copies. The tour was supposed to go for 2 weeks, but it was such a success. So, you know, we played to full houses everywhere we went, and so Sir Robert Carey just kept extending it. So I think we did about 4 weeks in the North Island, and then we were supposed to go to the South Island, and I was a bit concerned when they said we had to go to the South Island, because I heard that there was a singer down there who was going pretty well called Max Merritt. He had a huge fan club, you see, and I thought, I wonder how we're going to go down there. And I met Max and met all the fans and got up and sang with Max, and as a result, our show in Christchurch was a sellout.
Hey, all you cats come and gather round. Dig the latest crazy sound. Clap your hand and stamp your feet. Get over the dust.
I thought a lot of what Johnny was doing at the time was great, because you know, he'd certainly stirred things up around New Zealand. And Graham Dent, who was managing him at the time, ended up managing me many years later. And they pulled off some pretty good little publicity stunts at the time, you know, the pink Cadillac and the girls ripping the shirts, and, you know, it was all taken directly from Elvis, you know, but...
And, of course, you got your first fan riots, and, of course, old Graham Dent had them all geared up. What do you say? It's a nice night for stripping off shirts, and away they go and tear his shirt off.
And so then it became the scene for getting Devlin's shirt when he came out in front to sign the autograph. Said, "Oh, let's get his shirt," and it just snowballed. And everywhere we went, there's shirts ripped off and police protection everywhere. It actually got out of control.
Hysteria is what I would call it. Yeah. No, it was amazing. It was the first time we'd seen anything like it in New Zealand. So he loved it too.
We kept getting write-ups in the press. Just about every show that we did, it would become Press Association news right throughout the country. And before I knew where I was sort of from the Jive Centre in Auckland, just a singer at the Jive Centre in Auckland, to a national identity. And pretty mind-boggling.
Eventually, Kerajodian calls a halt to the madness. Then Devlin really is real gone, across the Tasman to join an Everly Brothers tour. His reign as New Zealand's king of rock and roll has lasted barely 18 months. Now there's new territory to conquer.
And I can remember walking down Pitt Street just after the tour had finished with the Everly Brothers. And I kept walking and walking and walking, and I thought to myself, my God, I've never struck a street so long in my life, because the streets in New Zealand just weren't that long. You know, from one end of Pitt Street to the other, from Central Station to the water. And I felt, at the time, I felt like a little ant. You know, I thought, there's millions of ants around, and I'm just one little ant. How am I going to make a name for myself in this country? But through the powers of television, and then the recording started, and the offers of work came in. And before we knew where we were, in 6 months, another short space of time, we were a national name in Australia.
Upper Hut jukebox, milk bar, and we'd sort of, the kids would hang around there after school or Friday night or whatever. And one of the first songs I ever played on the jukebox was That'll Be the Day by Buddy Holly. Great. Wondered how he got that sound on his guitar. Didn't know it was a Fender Stratocaster then. I was trying to do it on I think it was an Antoria or something. It wasn't even electric, it was just a horrible little acoustic guitar. And then I suddenly twigged that electric guitar's where it's all at. but I didn't know what that was.
Tough import controls make it almost impossible for keen young Kiwi rockers to get hold of electric guitars from America. There are a couple of local manufacturers, Jansen and Concord, but they don't quite cut it.
It was mainly the sound. You know, the New Zealand guitars didn't have the nice pickups in those days, and you couldn't get that real Fender sound. And plus, it was very hard to get amps in those days in New Zealand. Most everybody was using like a hi-fi amp or something with an old speaker.
Max and his band The Meteors still hold sway in Christchurch, but face stiff competition from Ray Columbus and the Invaders, who up the ante significantly when they get hold of real Fender guitars, thanks to their American contacts at Operation Deep Freeze.
One of the guys from the American base bought us up a guitar that he'd brought out with him from the States. Just happened to be a very nice old 1952 Stratocaster. And we sort of took a look at it and thought, oh yeah, okay. It looks all right, you know, it's just like Buddy Holly's one. So that was the first time we'd ever laid hands on a Fender guitar. Those sort of real guitars, as opposed to what we'd sort of been playing.
An enterprising Christchurch music shop starts importing Fender guitars and amplifiers. And first in the queue are Max and the Meteors, extremely keen to match the rival Invaders.
If they had guitars, we had to have guitars as well, so I ordered a bass. And I thought I'd order a Fender jazz bass because the Pooney, who was the bass player in the band at the time for Ray, had a Fender Precision, so that I'll get one up on that. So I got the more expensive one, and it cost me £126 if I remember rightly. Pretty cheap at the time. And I bought that, and then Max and Peter Williams ordered Strats, and we had white ones, and Ray and the guys had pink ones.
And then when we went to see Cliff Richard in the Shadows, sitting in the Majestic Theatre, we were upstairs. The Meteors were behind us, and we were in front, about the 2 rows in front of them. And when they said, ladies and gentlemen, there's Shadows, and Hank Marvin goes, bow, 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 bow. It just blew us out of the theatre. We all looked at each other and said, God, we haven't got the sound at all. Because they had these amazingly powerful amplifiers. And the sound was just awesome. That was the loudest sound we'd ever heard.
In Auckland, rock and roll has been sidelined by a swing back to pop and Dixieland jazz in the clubs and dance halls. The scene's perfectly set for the Fender-packing rockers from Christchurch.
Most of the local bands all were trying to be clones of Cliff and the Shads, and some of them were damn good too. But it was more of a pop genre than a rock genre, really. But then when Ray Columbus and the Invaders came up, wow, I mean, they were really a hot band. I thought they knocked me out. And they had all the gear, you know, they had the sound, and they were a really tight unit. It was a bit of an eye-opener for us. And we wondered we were wondering how the heck do they get all this equipment, because even then, we still couldn't buy Fender Stratocasters easily or Fender amplifiers just straight out of the music shop.
Doing the hand job to and fro. Opposite the mama, you should have died.
Possibly a bit of a novelty, really, because there weren't the two guitars, bass and drums type bands around at the time up there. They were sort of more dance bands with saxes and piano.
And when we did our first show at Shirley in Auckland, we just couldn't believe it, because we just blew them away. And we looked at each other and thought, wow. And all of a sudden, everybody wanted us. It was just quite remarkable. It was a very flourishing club scene. We would play the Monarch on Friday and Saturday nights. We'd play on Thursday nights at the Oriental. We'd play lunchtimes Monday to Friday for 2 hours at the Bally High, because there was no pub scene, there was no 10 o'clock closing, it was all 6 o'clock closing. There was nothing in pubs or taverns or whatever.
Max Merritt and the Meteors also find Auckland wide open.
We had an offer to open up a club in Auckland, which was called the Top 20. And that in itself was an experience. It was packed every night, and it was hot and sweaty and jumping. You know, it was a raging scene. You know, and of course you got to remember that we were, 4 young guys in the prime of our life, and boy, there's a lot of nice-looking girls around in those days.
It was a bit like a Christchurch contingent at that stage that came to Auckland and crashed the scene, and I think we'd made quite a major impact on the Auckland scene because there was Max and Ray and Dinah.
Diane Jacobs gets her start in a Christchurch nightclub run by her father, and she's great mates with Max and the Meteors. When they leave their Auckland club residency to go on tour, Max invites Diane and her group, the Playboys, up to keep the gig warm.
It was like, well, dreams come true. You worked every day, you know, every lunch hour, and just about every night and all weekend. We were all of a sudden full-time musicians. It was, wow, you know, we'd really made it. And there was a shop called The Casual Shop, which I always wanted to go into. It had these way-out clothes. So I thought, I'm going to go up there. I'll pluck up courage. I went up there. And there was a model there who was English. And she sort of had she was the first one ever, sort of had that semi-mod look. And I was looking through the racks and I was looking at this girl and I thought, wow, she looks cool. That's a good look. So I started talking to her and she said, oh, I know you. You know, I frequent the places, Top 20, and I know Max Merritt, and, you know, I go to the dance, I've seen you sing. And I said, gee, I love your look. She said, would you like it? I said, oh, yeah. You know, like I said, I've just had my hair done, but hey, let's do it. So I remember leaving there that day with this look and walking down the street and everybody staring at me and like this way out chick. And of course then I went to sing that night up at the Top 20. And I just don't know what happened, just with the look and everything. And the band started doing all this really crazy, shaking the head and these really jerky movements. And Dinah Lee was sort of born, but I wasn't even Dinah Lee then. I was still dear little Diane Jacobs, you know.
Renamed Dinah Lee by her record company, the Way Out Chick soon has a smash hit. Her cover of Don't You Know Yokomo, backed by Max and the Meteors, storms the hit parades in New Zealand and Australia. Dinah's invited to take her mod style across the Tasman for a television performance.
And I'll never forget, I went on the set of Sing 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 was the show, and there was everyone on it from all these sort of Australian stars that I heard of and all the girl singers, and they were still wearing their little full dresses and the beehive and the tees, and I looked around, I had these crazy mad mod shapeless dresses to the ground, and so of course I went on Sing 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 and Don't You Know Yokomo and did all these crazy movements with this way out thing, and wow, there it went. Because no one had seen the mod look in Australia as well. And they were still riding on the 50s crest where we were into the 60s, looking the 60s, influenced by the 60s and the sound. But the thing that really got me in those days was mothers hated me. They hated me because their daughters wanted to get the Dinah Lee haircut. And of course, you know, going from this sweet little girl going to school, and then all of a sudden they get this fringe and want to look like me. So mothers and fathers, I wasn't liked at all. But of course, who cares? The kids loved you, and that's what it was all about. You know, it was really great. You just influence these kids.
Early New Zealand television has a few teenage pop shows, but radio still makes the hits. Access to the airwaves is strictly controlled, and rock and roll is treated with great suspicion.
It wouldn't matter whether you were Elvis or the Beatles, you could have the biggest record in the world, you'd still be lucky if you got on New Zealand radio once a day. And of course our first single was a double-sided Columbus Russell composition, Died the Death of 1,000 Cuts. When I listen to it now, it's probably reasonable, because it was an original song, and they just refused to play it. It was NZBC. We weren't supposed to be good enough.
small-minded attitudes and the confines of a small country are also starting to rankle with Max Merritt and the Meteors.
You know, let's face it, you can only travel around the country so many times before you've sort of done every gig there is, and, you know, people either take you to heart or they get sick of you, you know. And so we didn't want to take that chance, and we thought, you know, let's give it a shot, you know. Just go across the pond and see what we can do. I must admit, when I first went to Sydney, I walked around Sydney, I felt like a grain of sand in the bottom of a bucket, you know, because it seemed so big to me after, you know, coming from Christchurch then to Auckland and seeing Sydney. And I thought, how in the hell are we going to get anybody to take notice of us over here, you know, because it seemed, you know, so huge. You know, we couldn't get arrested in Sydney. We moved to Melbourne, because the Melbourne scene was just enormous in those days. There were so many clubs. I mean, you know, it had little blues clubs everywhere, and, you know, and they were right into the blues, so it suited us to the ground. And that's where we started really, you know, kicking it.
For their next single, the Invaders cover a surfing instrumental from Denmark. The NZBC plays it once or twice. But when Ray tunes his shortwave radio into a Sydney station, he gets a pleasant surprise.
And I'm listening to 2SM radio and I hear Kapow being played on a surf, you know, by a surf DJ. And, you know, it was only 10 o'clock there. And he didn't seem to know where the band came from, just said, listen to this great surf track in 1963. And he was thrashing it. He said, yeah, he was going to play it all the time. So every night I'd go back after the show and listen, and sure enough, I'd hear Kapow again. And so eventually I phoned them up and said it was from New Zealand. So I talked to Zodiac Records, and we decided to go over and have a trip over there. And based ourselves in King's Cross, and started playing in Surf City.
By this time, the Invaders have a new bass player, Billy Christian, from their great rivals, the Meteors.
I got a phone call from Ray Columbus to say, do I want to join the Invaders? And I remember flying back to Auckland. We rehearsed for 2 days and headed for Sydney straight away.
We never lived there. We always just moved there for up to 3 months at a time and got playing contracts and called everybody in 1963 that I could find. Anyone I read in the showbiz columns and call them up and say, my name's Ray Columbus and I had the greatest band in the world. And most of the people hung up on me or, you know, just called me a big head or whatever.
Yes, well, that's Ray, anyway. He's naturally like that, and still is, and does a great job at it. Not that we sort of rode along, everyone chipped in, and that Ray sort of had a bit more of an understanding of the business side of things and made sure that, you know, we all had a bit of pocket money and it was all together. So it was good having Ray. We probably wouldn't have made it without him.
The 1964 Beatles tour creates unprecedented scenes of rock and roll adulation. Mainstream New Zealand is finally forced to sit up and take notice, and the kids love it.
The vibe with the young kids in the 60s was just huge. I don't know if it's ever been as intense as it was during that era of the 60s. I guess once the Beatles came out, all the local kids thought that it was the thing to do to kind of scream at bands. I guess there was starting to become an acceptance that we had our own Kiwi stars.
Kids just let loose and enjoyed themselves and loved their pop stars, screamed at you on stage, wanted a piece of you. You know, if you're in theatres, would climb up drain pipes to try and get into your dressing room to see you, just to get an autograph. Just wanted to be with you. Then you'd talk to your fans and you'd start talking to them. They'd just sit there and they'd just break down and cry because it was like, wow, to them, just being with you was like just too overwhelming.
Dinah's riding the crest of the mod wave and hits big with Blue Beat and Reet Petite. But she too realises she has to leave the country to further her career and beats the increasingly familiar path to Australia. As she leaves, her old Christchurch mates, Ray and the Invaders, record a new song in Auckland.
She's a mod, 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 yeah, yeah.
She's a Mod came out of a pile of
reject 45s from some English record company that would... Our record company would just get all these records saying, here, release what you want to. And She's a Mod somehow got left out of that and was in the throwaway pile, and we just picked it up.
The guys in the band didn't like it that much. They rocked it up a bit and put some extra things in it, da-da-dum, bum, 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 all that sort of stuff. But I could see, as soon as I heard it, I thought, oh, this is us. This is going to be a smash.
But no, I didn't think too much about She's a Mod at the time until it started to get interest. And I, I'm still amazed that it actually did as well as it did. It's not sort of a great song as such. It seems to me to be a novelty type song. And it went to #1 and stayed there for quite a while. In fact, it stayed in the charts for 53 weeks.
She's a Mod was #1 for 7 weeks around the country. I mean, it was just perfect for us. So there was just no looking back. From then on, we were just pow. It was great.
Mass hysteria. Chased down the streets, screaming teenagers, all that sort of pop star stuff. Lots of magazine articles, pictures, autograph signings, or everything that came along with it. The girls would scream, the guys would yell. It was good fun. And it always happened, we used to get chased down the road by girls. We've been chased down Castlereagh Street with about 100 girls chasing us, and we were running for our lives in our black satin suits, and I mean, it was real stuff, just like the Beatles, and that felt really good, made you feel special, more inspirational, and more rock and roll, basically. It's pretty solid stuff.